A tailor sewed late into the night, only to be found wrapped in his final design. Welcome to Marple Casebook. I am your host, Selwyn. Let's connect across the globe. Drop a comment and tell me where you're tuning in from. Your messages truly make this channel come alive. Let's begin. The village of St. Mary Mead had seen its share of peculiar incidents, but nothing quite like the death of Jeremiah Fellows, the local tailor. His shop, a quaint, cluttered space filled with bolts of fabric, half-finished coats, and the ever-present scent of pressed wool, had been locked from the inside when Constable Wilkins forced his way in. What he found sent ripples through the quiet town, a man, alone, lifeless, and, inexplicably, a needle driven straight into his throat. Miss Jane Marple, having been summoned by her dear friend Mrs. Bantry, who had an unshakable knack for knowing when something wasn't quite right, arrived at the scene just as Inspector Craddock examined the body. The tailor's head lay slumped forward on his work table, his spectacles askew, and beside him a swatch of deep navy fabric, partially stitched with a row of neat, meticulous stitches. "A locked room," murmured Miss Marple, peering over her glasses at the door. "No sign of forced entry, and yet murder. How terribly inconvenient for the poor man." Craddock sighed. "There are no signs of a struggle, and apart from the needle, there's no obvious weapon. The only thing of note is that bolt of cloth. He was stitching something, but it looks ordinary enough." Miss Marple's keen eyes flickered toward the fabric. She reached for it, running her fingers along the stitching. "Not quite," she said after a moment. "Do you see this? It's not a proper seam. It's merely a line of basting stitches. Temporary, meant to be removed." Craddock frowned. "And that tells us what exactly?" Miss Marple merely smiled, though her eyes remained sharp with thought. Perhaps that Mr. Fellows was working on something he did not intend to finish. The room yielded little else. The only window was locked from the inside. The door had been bolted as well. It seemed impossible that anyone could have entered or left without breaking the lock or leaving some sign of intrusion. The shelves were neatly arranged, the measuring tape draped over a chair, and his ledger, filled with orders for new coats and repairs, sat open on the counter, the last entry written in a steady, careful hand. It was a puzzle, and Miss Marple delighted in puzzles. She turned to Constable Wilkins, a well-meaning but easily flustered young man. "Who found him?" "His apprentice, ma'am, a lad named Thomas Finch. He usually comes in the morning to prepare the shop for customers, but today the door wouldn't open. We had to break in." "Ah," Miss Marple nodded. "And what did young Mr. Finch have to say?" The boy, a gangly youth with an anxious expression, had been waiting, outside, wringing his hands. When he was brought in, he kept his eyes fixed on the floor, shifting nervously from foot to foot. "I swear, ma'am, I don't know what happened. I came in at the usual time, but the door wouldn't budge. I knocked and knocked, but Mr. Fellows never answered. I even tried the back, but it was locked too." Miss Marple studied him closely. "Did Mr. Fellows seem troubled of late?" Thomas hesitated. Well, maybe. He got a letter 2 days ago that upset him. I don't know who sent it, but after he read it, he went quiet. Kept muttering to himself, and yesterday he stayed late, saying he had something important to do." Miss Marple's fingers twitched slightly, though she kept her voice light. "This letter, did you happen to see what it said?" "No, ma'am, but he stuffed it into his pocket like he didn't want anyone else reading it." Craddock made a note. "We'll have to see if we can find that letter." Miss Marple turned back to the tailor's lifeless form. "And the needle," she mused. "A most unusual weapon. Not impossible, of course, but rather difficult to drive in so deeply. That would require precision, or force." Craddock gave her a wary look. "You're suggesting it wasn't self-inflicted?" "Oh, my dear Inspector," she said, smiling gently. "I would never suggest something so absurd." The answer lay somewhere within this room, among the cloth, the stitches, and the unfinished work of a man who had clearly known something he should not. Miss Marple let her eyes linger on the body of Jeremiah Fellows, the needle still embedded in his throat, an oddly brutal contrast to the quiet, methodical work of his trade. The inspector and the constable had turned their attention to searching for the letter, but Miss Marple remained near the work table, her gloved fingers lightly grazing the fabric left behind. A row of temporary stitches, basting, not meant to hold. Why had he been sewing something that would never be finished? As she mused, her gaze wandered to the spools of thread arranged meticulously on a nearby shelf. Navy, charcoal, ivory, each placed with the careful precision of a man who had spent years in quiet diligence. But then, something peculiar. A spool of red thread standing out against the others. It was not an unusual color, but it did not belong in this particular arrangement. The red spool had been hastily dropped on its side, unlike the others which were upright and neatly stacked. Miss Marple reached out and turned the spool slightly, noting the thread's end had been snapped, not cut, a minor detail, but an important one. She tucked that thought away just as Inspector Craddock let out a dissatisfied grunt from across the room. No sign of that letter. If it was in his pocket, it's gone now. Miss Marple sighed softly. Which means someone removed it, and since Mr. Fellows was locked in, the person who took it must have done so before. The door was bolted. Craddock nodded. Exactly. But then we have a problem, don't we? If someone was here before the door was locked, how did they get out? Miss Marple turned toward Thomas Finch, the tailor's young apprentice, still fidgeting near the doorway. His wide eyes darted around the room and his fingers twisted the hem of his sleeve. "Thomas, my dear," she said in a kindly voice, "did Mr. Fellows ever keep a spare key?" The boy's head snapped up. "A spare key? Oh no, ma'am. He never trusted those. Always said locks were only as strong as the people who held the keys." Miss Marple smiled gently. Very sensible of him. She glanced once more at the work table, where the needle had been driven into the man's throat. "Did you say he stayed late last night?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did you hear him leave?" Thomas hesitated, shifting his weight. I think so. I mean, I went home before him, and when I came back in the morning, the door was locked, like always." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "And did he have any visitors yesterday?" Thomas's lips parted slightly, as if he were about to deny it outright, but then he hesitated again. "Well," he said, his voice quieter now, "there was someone." Craddock's gaze sharpened. "Who?" "I don't know his name," Thomas admitted, wringing his hands. "Never seen him before, but he came in late, right before I was about to leave. He was tall, wore a dark coat, and had a deep voice. I didn't hear much, but Mr. Fellows wasn't happy to see him." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but she took in every word carefully. And what did this man do? They talked in low voices, but Mr. Fellows got all flustered. He kept saying something about not wanting any trouble, and I don't have it anymore. The man didn't stay long. He left, and Mr. Fellows just stood there for a long time looking nervous. Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. "That letter, I'll bet," he murmured. "Whoever wrote it came in person." Miss Marple's thoughts were already moving forward. "And this morning," she said, "when you came to work and found the door locked, did anything seem different?" Thomas blinked. I don't think so." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, coaxing. "Think carefully, dear. Anything out of place, even the smallest thing." He frowned in concentration, then suddenly snapped his fingers. "The curtains." "The curtains?" Craddock asked, puzzled. Thomas nodded eagerly now, as if realizing it for the first time. "They were drawn shut. Mr. Fellows never left them closed overnight. He liked the morning light to come in first thing. But today they were pulled tight." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the window. The latch was still locked from the inside, as it had been when they entered. "And yet She crossed the room and reached out, gently drawing the fabric back. Caesar, she did. Something small and thin tumbled onto the window sill. A single strand of red thread. Miss Marple's eyes sparkled as she turned it over in her fingers. The broken thread, a sign of something being disturbed. But what? She glanced toward the apprentice. Thomas, did Mr. Fellows sew with red thread yesterday? The boy looked perplexed. No, ma'am. He was working on a navy suit for Mr. Prescott. He wouldn't have used red. Miss Marple turned to Craddock, her voice thoughtful. Which means that red thread came from something else entirely. Something or someone that was here after Mr. Fellows finished his work. The inspector frowned. But that still doesn't explain how anyone got out. Miss Marple smiled to herself. The full picture remained hazy, but she could see the edges taking shape. Someone had been here. Someone who did not belong. And though the method of escape remained a mystery, one thing was now clear. Jeremiah Fellows had been killed for something he knew, and his murderer had tried, quite unsuccessfully, to make it seem as though he had died alone. Miss Marple let the red thread slip between her fingers, her mind weaving its own pattern of connections. Someone had been inside the tailor's shop after Jeremiah Fellows finished his work. Someone who had left behind only the tiniest of clues. A strand of red thread, a hastily drawn curtain, a missing letter. The room had been locked, the door bolted from within. But Miss Marple did not believe in the impossible. There was always a way. Inspector Craddock, still frowning at the window, turned back toward the young apprentice. Thomas, when you saw this visitor last night, you said he was wearing a dark coat. Did you notice anything else? His face? His voice? Anything that might help? Thomas chewed his lip, hesitant. Well, he spoke low but not rough. More like someone used to giving orders, if that makes sense. Miss Marple gave an encouraging nod. And did Mr. Fellows call him by name? Thomas's forehead creased in concentration. No, but he did say something odd. When the man was about to leave, Mr. Fellows said, "You won't get anything from me, not after last time." Craddock exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. Last time? What do you suppose that means? Miss Marple merely smiled. That, my dear Inspector, is what we must find out. Outside, the village bustled with its usual quiet rhythm, unaware that a crime of peculiar cunning had taken place in its heart. The first person to speak with was the woman who knew everything that passed through St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Annie Green, the postmistress. The post office, a narrow little building wedged between the grocer's and the butcher's, smelled of ink and old paper. Mrs. Green, a sharp-eyed woman with a keen nose for gossip, greeted them with barely concealed curiosity. "I thought you might be along," she said, setting aside a stack of letters. "Terrible business, poor Mr. Fellows. And so unexpected." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Oh, I dare say most murders are unexpected, my dear. Tell me, did you happen to notice any unusual letters sent to him in the last few days?" Mrs. Green leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Funny you should ask. He did get one that struck me as peculiar. No return address, and the handwriting, very firm, very precise. Not at all like the usual letters he received. He read it right here, and I tell you, his face went as white as a sheet." Inspector Craddock pulled out his notebook. "Did he say anything about it?" He muttered something under his breath, something about "not again." Then he folded it up quick and stuffed it into his pocket. Miss Marple's smile never wavered. "You do have a wonderful memory, Mrs. Green." The postmistress preened slightly. "Well, one notices things. And I did notice that a stranger was hanging about that day, loitering just outside." Craddock straightened. "Can you describe him?" Mrs. Green pursed her lips. "Tall, dark coat, looked well-dressed, but not a gentleman, if you take my meaning. He didn't go into the shop, just watched from across the way." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on her handbag. "And have you seen him since?" "No, and I'd remember if I had." As they left the post office, Craddock exhaled sharply. That's 2 mentions of a last time, and now a stranger keeping watch. Fellows knew something dangerous. But what? Miss Marple said nothing, though her thoughts were already circling the answer. Their next stop was the home of Mr. Alfred Prescott, a gentleman farmer and the last customer listed in Fellow's ledger. He greeted them stiffly at the door, his expression guarded. "I don't see how I can help," he said, ushering them into a sitting room furnished in dark oak and heavy drapes. "I ordered a suit, yes, but I hadn't even picked it up yet." Craddock studied him. "Did you speak with Mr. Fellows in the last few days?" Prescott hesitated. "Too long." "Briefly." Miss Marple, ever attuned to the subtleties of human nature, tilted her head slightly. "Oh, but surely you knew him well. St. Mary Mead is such a small place, after all." Prescott's mouth twitched. "We had dealings, yes." "And yet," Miss Marple said gently, "he seemed to think he was in some kind of trouble." The farmer's eyes darkened. "If he was, I had nothing to do with it." Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands, the way his gaze flickered toward the window, as though checking for something unseen. A man nervous, uncertain, not necessarily guilty, but hiding something all the same. Outside, Craddock muttered, "He's lying about something." Miss Marple agreed. "But not about the murder. He is afraid, Inspector. The question is, of what?" Their next visit was to a woman of quite a different temperament. Miss Lillian Hartley, a seamstress who occasionally assisted Mr. Fellows with finer work. She welcomed them into her parlor with the air of someone quite eager to be useful. "Oh, it's dreadful," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. "Jeremiah was such a dear man. I simply can't imagine why anyone would do such a thing." Miss Marple observed her carefully. "And yet, my dear, you seem quite certain it was murder." Lillian blinked rapidly. "Well, wasn't it?" Craddock raised an eyebrow. "We haven't exactly announced that yet." A brief pause, a tightening of the lips, then a forced little laugh. "Oh, well, I only assumed—" Miss Marple reached for her teacup. "Miss Hartley, do you know anything about a red thread?" Lillian's hand jerked slightly. "Red?" "Yes," Miss Marple continued, sipping delicately. "It was found at the scene, and it is quite interesting because Mr. Fellows wasn't working with red thread at all." Lillian's fingers clenched in her lap. I don't see what that has to do with me." Miss Marple set her cup down gently. "You do so, do you not?" The woman swallowed. "Yes, but I haven't been in his shop in days." Miss Marple did not press further. The silence did that for her. As they left, Craddock sighed. One man too nervous, one woman too eager, and still no clear suspect. Miss Marple's lips curved slightly. But you see, Inspector, the truth is a bit like sewing. Pull one wrong thread, and the whole pattern begins to unravel. And unravel it surely would." Miss Marple walked slowly through the narrow streets of St. Mary Mead, the damp morning air carrying the faint scent of earth and fabric dye from the tailor's shop. Inspector Craddock walked beside her, flipping through his notebook with a frown. "The trouble is," he muttered, "every single person we've spoken to has something to hide, but none of them fit neatly into this murder." He tapped his pencil against the page. Prescott, clearly nervous, but frightened rather than guilty. Miss Hartley, far too quick to suggest murder before we did. And then there's Thomas, the apprentice, who swears the door was locked, but hesitated when he spoke about the visitor. Miss Marple nodded, her gloved hands clasped in front of her. "Oh yes, dear boy. Hesitated just long enough for me to suspect he knows more than he's saying. But the question remains, what precisely is he afraid of?" Craddock exhaled sharply. "And that stranger Mrs. Green saw, the tall man in the dark coat? Fellows told him, not after last time. That suggests history, a past connection. But a connection to what?" Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with thought. "I do believe, Inspector, that we have been looking at our puzzle the wrong way round. Craddock shot her a curious glance. How so? She paused just outside the shop, her gaze drifting toward the sign above the door. Jeremiah Fellows, tailor and cutter. The way we tell a story often depends on where we begin. We have been treating Mr. Fellows's death as a singular event, but what if we viewed it as part of something larger? Craddock frowned. Larger. Miss Marple nodded. Something that happened before. Something that left our poor tailor frightened enough to tell two separate people, in two different ways, that he wanted no further part in it. Craddock shut his notebook with a sigh. Well, the only way to figure that out is to go deeper. Back inside the tailor's shop, Thomas was stacking bolts of fabric, his fingers twitching as they smoothed the cloth. He flinched slightly when Miss Marple and Craddock entered, but quickly forced a polite smile. "Thomas, dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "I wonder if you might help me with something. I've been thinking about poor Mr. Fellows and what might have been troubling him before his death. It must have been something quite serious, don't you think?" Thomas swallowed. I don't know, ma'am." Miss Marple smiled gently. "You see, dear, I rather think you do." His fingers clenched the edge of a measuring tape. "I told you everything I know." "But you hesitated, Thomas," she said, her voice as soft as silk. "Last night, when you spoke about the visitor, you didn't say what time he left." Thomas's lips parted, but no words came out. Craddock stepped forward. "Tell us the truth now, lad. This isn't the time for secrets." Thomas exhaled shakily. He never left through the door." The air in the shop seemed to still. Miss Marple tilted her head. "Then how, dear boy, did he leave?" Thomas looked toward the window, then back at them. "The back door," he whispered. Craddock's eyebrows shot up. "There is no back door." "There is," Thomas insisted. "But it's hidden. It was made when the shop was first built. Mr. Fellows never used it, but he showed it to me once. Said it was just an old thing from years ago." Miss Marple's mind leapt to the drawn curtains, the displaced thread, a hidden door. Craddock's face darkened. "Where is it?" Thomas hesitated only a moment before moving toward a panel at the back of the shop, near the shelving. He pressed lightly at the side, and with a faint creak, the wooden panel shifted, revealing a narrow passageway just wide enough for a man to slip through. "Well, I'll be," Craddock muttered, peering into the darkness. Miss Marple's gaze flickered back to Thomas. "Did you see him use it?" Thomas shook his head quickly. "No, but after he left, Mr. Fellows just stood there, staring at that hidden door, like he was afraid of it." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "He was afraid, Thomas, because whatever this man wanted, it was something Mr. Fellows thought was gone. But it had found him again." The inspector straightened. "We need to know what. And I think our next visit should be to someone who might just give us an answer." They found Miss Lillian Hartley in her small cottage, her hands trembling slightly as she threaded a needle. When she looked up, her face held a guarded expression. "Oh dear, more questions?" Miss Marple smiled. "Just a few, my dear." She took a seat near the window, watching Lillian's fingers shake ever so slightly. "I've been thinking about that red thread, you know." Lillian's lips tightened. "And?" "Well, you see, it is quite curious," Miss Marple continued. "You work with finer materials, don't you? Silks, delicate embroidery. But this thread was coarse, the kind used for stronger stitching. It made me wonder if it wasn't from a garment at all." Lillian's needle slipped. Craddock stepped forward. "What aren't you telling us, Miss Hartley?" She bit her lip. Miss Marple's voice was kind, but firm. "Lillian, did Mr. Fellows ever do any work that was unusual?" The woman closed her eyes briefly. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He altered documents." A heavy silence settled over the room. Craddock's face hardened. "Forgery?" Lillian gave a small nod. Only once, a long time ago. He never wanted to, but he was forced into it. Miss Marple's heart ached for the tailor, a man drawn into something beyond his control. And this man, the one who visited him, was he connected to that? Lillian exhaled shakily. I think so. Fellows never told me details, but he was terrified of something resurfacing. He kept saying, if they find me, it won't end well. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And what did he forge? Lillian hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, a will. Craddock's jaw tightened. A forged will, and now he's dead. Miss Marple laced her fingers together. Ah, she murmured. Then I rather think, Inspector, that we must find out whose fortune Mr. Fellows rewrote, because that, I suspect, is the key to his murder. Inspector Craddock wasted no time. The moment Lillian Hartley uttered the words a will, he straightened with renewed purpose. Forgery is a serious business, he said, snapping his notebook shut. If Fellows altered a will, someone had a great deal to lose, or to gain. Miss Marple gave a small nod, her mind already weaving the pattern. Yes, indeed, Inspector. And if the past has taught us anything, it is that money, especially ill-gotten money, can drive a person to the most dreadful acts. Craddock turned to Lillian. Who was involved? She hesitated. I don't know exactly. Fellows never told me the names. He only said he had done it for someone powerful, and that he'd been promised it would never come back to haunt him. Miss Marple sighed softly. Ah, but guilt has a way of lingering, doesn't it? And fear is even more persistent. It was enough for Craddock to move forward. Within the hour, his inquiries led them to the solicitor's office of Mr. Harold Kent, a man with thinning hair and an air of perpetual nervousness. When questioned about any contested wills, he fidgeted before reluctantly admitting that, years ago, a wealthy landowner, Mr. Richard Godfrey, had passed away under uncertain circumstances. His fortune had unexpectedly gone to a distant nephew, a Mr. Alfred Prescott, the very same Alfred Prescott who had been acting most uneasily under questioning. Craddock's jaw tightened as he and Miss Marple left the solicitor's office. So, Prescott inherits a fortune after a suspiciously altered will, and now the man who forged it turns up dead. Seems fairly straightforward. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. She gazed down the cobbled street, her blue eyes lost in thought. It does seem so, yes. Prescott did not bother to hide his irritation when Craddock and Miss Marple arrived at his estate. Really, Inspector, I've told you everything I know. This is becoming rather tiresome. Craddock's voice was clipped. Tiresome, Mr. Prescott, is when a man alters a will conveniently benefiting you and then turns up dead. Prescott's face darkened. If you're accusing me, Miss Marple interjected gently. No one is accusing anyone, dear, but it is strange, is it not, that Jeremiah Fellows was so afraid, and that his fear caught up with him so suddenly. Prescott scoffed, but there was unease in his eyes. If you think I had anything to do with that will, you're mistaken. I didn't even know it had been altered. Craddock's patience was running thin. You expect us to believe that? Prescott crossed his arms. Believe what you like. If you're so certain, why don't you go and check my movements? I was at my estate the entire evening. Miss Marple tilted her head. And yet, dear Mr. Prescott, fear is a funny thing. It spreads. I wonder, did Mr. Fellows' fear spread to you as well? A muscle in his jaw twitched. That evening, a search of Prescott's estate uncovered a stack of old documents buried in his desk. Among them was a copy of the original will, one that bequeathed the fortune not to Prescott, but to a long-lost brother of Mr. Godfrey's. It was clear evidence that a forgery had taken place. It was enough. The following morning, Inspector Craddock formally arrested Alfred Prescott for conspiracy and fraud. The town buzzed with the news, and for all intents and purposes, the case seemed solved. And yet, something gnawed at Miss Marple. That evening, as she sat in her quiet cottage, knitting by the fire, she reflected on every piece of the puzzle. The forged will, Prescott's inheritance, Fellow's fear, the man in the dark coat, the red thread. Something did not fit. She frowned slightly. The red thread. It had been in the shop, a tailor's shop, but it was the wrong kind of thread. Her fingers stilled. No, it was not the wrong kind of thread. It had simply been used for the wrong purpose. A deep unease settled over her. The true murderer was still out there, waiting. They had just arrested the wrong man. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resting idly in her lap. The flickering glow cast long shadows across the room, but the only shadow that concerned her was the one looming over the case. Alfred Prescott had been arrested, but the pieces did not quite fit. The will, the hidden door, the mysterious visitor, none of it truly explained Jeremiah Fellow's death. It was too easy, too neat, as if someone had laid out the evidence just so, guiding them toward a convenient solution. Her mind returned to the red thread. It had felt out of place from the beginning, not because it was unusual for a tailor's shop, but because it was the wrong type for clothing. It was coarse, strong, not for sewing garments, but for something sturdier, binding something, or someone. She inhaled sharply. The red thread had not been a clue to what was being stitched, it was a clue to what had been undone. Rising quickly, she wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and set out into the damp night air. The village lay quiet, save for the distant hoot of an owl, but she had no time for hesitation. There was someone she needed to see. Miss Lillian Hartley answered the door with a look of tired resignation. "Miss Marple," she said softly, stepping aside to let her in. "I suppose you're not here for a social call." Miss Marple's eyes were gentle but knowing. "I rather think, dear, that you have been keeping secrets for far too long." Lillian's fingers trembled as she clutched the edge of her shawl. "I told you everything I knew." "Oh no, dear, I don't think you did." Miss Marple's tone remained soft, but firm. "You told us about the forged will. You told us about Jeremiah Fellow's fear. But what you did not tell us was why he came to you, of all people, the night before he died." Lillian's face paled. "How did you—" "The red thread," Miss Marple said simply. "You see, dear, it wasn't from a garment at all. It was from something else. Something Fellows brought to you because he trusted you to remove it." Lillian's breath hitched. "You don't understand." "I do understand," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Jeremiah Fellows came to you in distress, and whatever he brought, whatever he wanted gone, was tied with that red thread. You removed it for him, didn't you?" The woman's lips parted, then pressed into a thin line. Finally, with a shuddering breath, she nodded. "It was a book," she whispered. "A small old book bound with red thread. He was shaking when he handed it to me, told me to burn it, destroy it. He said if I didn't, someone would kill him." Miss Marple's heart sank. "But you didn't burn it, did you?" Lillian shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't. I didn't know what it was, but it felt important. I hid it." Miss Marple reached out and squeezed her hand. "And now, dear, we must find it." With trembling fingers, Lillian retrieved the book from beneath a loose floorboard. It was small, leather-bound, and aged, the faint scent of ink and dust rising from its pages. Miss Marple carefully undid the remaining traces of red thread, opening it to reveal line after line of precise, meticulous handwriting. "What is it?" Lillian asked nervously. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the pages, and a cold certainty settled over her. "A ledger," she murmured. "Names, transactions. But these are not ordinary records." She turned to a page marked with a familiar name. Richard Godfrey. The amount listed beside it was staggering. Lillian peered over her shoulder. "That's the man whose will was forged." Miss Marple nodded, flipping through more pages. These entries go back years. Blackmail, perhaps, or payments of another nature. Then she paused. Another name leapt from the page. Jeremiah Fellows. Lillian gasped. You mean he wasn't just a victim? He was part of it. Miss Marple exhaled softly. Perhaps once, but I rather think he tried to leave it behind. She traced a finger along the last entry beside Fellows' name, marked with a single, chilling word. Forfeit. A heavy silence fell between them. Lillian swallowed hard. Miss Marple, if Prescott wasn't the one who killed him, then... A sudden noise outside made them both jump. Miss Marple's mind raced. The case had never been about a single crime. It had never been just about a will. It was about something much older, deeper. Something someone had killed to keep buried. She closed the book, slipping it into her pocket. Lillian, dear, she said calmly, though her voice held an urgency Lillian did not miss. I believe it is time we paid Inspector Craddock a visit, before the true killer decides to silence us as well. Miss Marple and Lillian Hartley moved swiftly through the dimly lit village streets, the small leather-bound ledger tucked safely inside Miss Marple's handbag. Every rustling leaf and shifting shadow felt like a potential threat, but Miss Marple remained composed. She had encountered danger before, and she knew that fear only served those who wished to manipulate it. When they arrived at the police station, Inspector Craddock was seated at his desk, rubbing his temples. He looked up sharply as they entered, his eyes narrowing at their urgency. This had better be good, he muttered, reaching for his cup of tea. Miss Marple wasted no time, placing the book on his desk and gently opening it to the page marked with Jeremiah Fellows' name. Inspector, I believe this is what our dear Mr. Fellows died for. Craddock leaned in, his expression shifting from irritation to intrigue as he scanned the neatly recorded transactions. Good Lord, he murmured. These aren't just payments. These are bribes, debts, blackmail. His finger trailed down the column until it landed on Richard Godfrey's name. He exhaled sharply. This connects everything, the altered will, Fellows' murder. And someone has been ensuring these secrets remain buried, Miss Marple finished quietly. Craddock frowned, flipping through the pages. Prescott's name isn't listed here. No, Miss Marple agreed, because I believe he was never meant to be involved. He was merely convenient, a pawn to take the fall. Craddock straightened. Then we've arrested the wrong man. Miss Marple gave him a look of patient encouragement. But we still have a chance to catch the right one. The inspector exhaled. I suppose you have a plan. Her eyes twinkled. Oh, nothing terribly complicated. Just a bit of misdirection. The next morning, word spread quickly that an important piece of evidence had been recovered. The police had, supposedly, found a hidden letter that detailed the full extent of the conspiracy. Inspector Craddock let the information slip in the village square, ensuring that certain heirs would hear it. Miss Marple, meanwhile, positioned herself in the place she knew the true killer would eventually come, Lillian Hartley's shop. The small bell over the door jingled, and Miss Marple turned, unsurprised to find Mr. Harold Kent, the nervous solicitor, standing in the doorway. His face was carefully composed, but the way his hands trembled slightly as he removed his hat did not escape her notice. Miss Marple, he greeted, his voice smooth but a fraction too forced. What a pleasant surprise. She smiled warmly. Mr. Kent, how lovely to see you. I do hope you aren't here about that dreadful business with Mr. Fellows. His smile flickered. Ah, well, unfortunate, yes. But it seems the police have solved it, haven't they? Miss Marple tilted her head. So they thought. But then, dear Inspector Craddock came across an extraordinary letter. Kent froze. It was barely a hesitation, just a flicker of muscle along his jaw, but it was enough. A letter, he echoed, too lightly. Oh yes, Miss Marple continued, watching him carefully. A confession of sorts, really. It seems Mr. Fellows had been keeping a record of things, and, well, you know how these things are. Secrets have a way of revealing themselves. Kent chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Is that so? Miss Marple leaned forward, knitting resting idly in her lap. Indeed. And you know what I find most curious? The mention of a particular solicitor, someone who handled many of these rather questionable legal arrangements. Kent stiffened. That could be anyone. Oh, quite, she agreed pleasantly. But the most fascinating part was that he named an accomplice, someone who assisted in the, shall we say, more delicate matters. Particularly the matter of ensuring that anyone who became a liability disappeared. Silence stretched between them. Then Kent reached into his pocket. Miss Marple's voice did not waver. I wouldn't, dear. Kent hesitated just long enough for the door behind him to open. Inspector Craddock stepped inside, his gaze sharp. Put it down, Kent, he ordered. Kent's fingers twitched around the small object in his pocket. A pocket knife, not a gun, but deadly all the same. With a defeated sigh, he let it drop to the floor. Craddock strode forward and clamped a hand on his arm. I should have known you were involved from the start. Miss Marple gave a small, approving nod. Oh, but you see, Inspector, Mr. Kent was not simply involved. He was the orchestrator. He knew of the altered will long before it came into question, but he also knew that Fellows had begun to grow uneasy. He knew Fellows had kept something, records perhaps, or even names. And the moment he suspected Fellows had proof, he acted. Kent's face twisted. You can't prove I killed him. Miss Marple's gaze was kind, almost sorrowful. Oh, my dear man, you just did. Craddock tightened his grip on the solicitor's arm. You made one mistake, Kent. You came looking for something that didn't exist. There was no letter. But you believed it, didn't you? And that's all the proof we need. Kent's shoulders slumped as the weight of his own mistake settled over him. As Craddock led the defeated solicitor away, Lillian turned to Miss Marple, awe written across her face. You tricked him into revealing himself. Miss Marple smiled, picking up her knitting once more. Oh, my dear, people do have a dreadful habit of telling on themselves. All one has to do is listen. The village had always been a quiet place, where gossip traveled faster than the wind, but now there was a new undercurrent in the air. Fear. Harold Kent's arrest had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, and yet Miss Marple felt no satisfaction. There was something unfinished, something just beyond her grasp. The ledger had provided a web of connections, but it had not answered everything. There was still one question lingering in her mind. Who else wanted this buried? That evening, as Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, she opened her handbag to retrieve the ledger. Her fingers brushed against soft fabric, her hand closing around empty air. A chill passed over her. The book was gone. She inhaled sharply, her mind racing. It had been in her possession when she left the police station. She had come home, set her bag down, and had not left since. No one had entered. Had they? She stood, moving to her small parlor, carefully checking every corner, though she already knew it would be in vain. The ledger had been taken. Miss Marple was not a woman given to panic, but she felt a rare moment of unease. Someone had risked everything to steal it, and that meant one thing. The case was far from over. The next morning she visited Inspector Craddock, her expression composed, but her words measured. Inspector, we have a problem. Craddock frowned as she relayed the theft. He drummed his fingers against the desk. Damn it all! That book was the last solid link to the conspiracy. Miss Marple adjusted her gloves. Indeed, and yet the timing is most peculiar, wouldn't you say? Craddock sighed. Kent's in custody, and unless he has accomplices, which I suppose is possible, this means there's someone else who isn't quite as pleased as we are. Miss Marple nodded. Precisely. Someone who knew the book was in my possession and who had the means to retrieve it. Craddock leaned back in his chair. So we start with those who had access. That means... He paused, his brow furrowing. Blast. That means just about anyone, doesn't it? Word spread quickly after Kent's arrest. Miss Marple offered a small smile. Ah, but dear Inspector, we must think not just about opportunity, but about desperation. Who had the most to lose if that ledger remained in our hands? Craddock exhaled sharply. Godfrey's family, perhaps. Anyone else named in those pages. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag. And someone with the skill to enter a home undetected. Craddock's eyes darkened. A professional. The idea was unsettling, but it made sense. The crime had been too precise for an amateur. There had been no signs of forced entry, no disturbance, just the missing book. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to a name that had appeared multiple times in the ledger, one that had been overlooked in favor of more obvious suspects. Edward Lawley, a discreet man with no direct ties to the will, but one who had benefited from several of the payments recorded in Fellow's notes. He was not an obvious suspect, but that was precisely why Miss Marple found him interesting. They paid Lawley a visit that afternoon, arriving at his modest but well-kept home. He answered the door with the cool composure of a man who had expected them. Miss Marple, he said pleasantly, though his eyes flicked warily to Craddock. To what do I owe this pleasure? Miss Marple smiled. Oh, my dear Mr. Lawley, I do so detest loose ends, and I rather think you might help us tie one up. Lawley raised an eyebrow. I can't imagine how I would be of assistance. Craddock crossed his arms. We know the ledger is missing. We also know you had reason to want it gone. Lawley chuckled, shaking his head. That sounds quite dramatic, Inspector. If the book is missing, perhaps you should check with your own department. Corruption does have a way of creeping into the most unexpected places. Craddock stiffened, but Miss Marple merely tilted her head. Such an interesting suggestion, she mused. It does make one wonder. How would you know it was missing unless you had reason to believe it might be? A flicker of irritation passed over Lawley's face. It's hardly a secret, Miss Marple. News travels fast in a village. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. Oh, indeed. But theft, my dear, is not gossip. It is action, and the only people who take action are those who stand to gain something from it. Lawley exhaled sharply, stepping back from the doorway. You're grasping at straws, old woman. Craddock stepped forward, his voice firm. Where is the book, Lawley? For the first time, the man hesitated. It was brief, but it was there. Miss Marple smiled kindly. You see, dear, that is the problem with removing evidence. You may have erased the record, but you have not erased the knowledge of what was in it. And I rather think, no matter how carefully you covered your tracks, there is still something, some detail, you overlooked. Lawley's face darkened. You have nothing. Miss Marple's expression did not waver. Oh, but I do. You have just confirmed that you were involved. His jaw clenched. That's nonsense. Is it? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. You see, when something is stolen, most people react with sympathy or shock. You, however, immediately suggested the police were involved. That, my dear Mr. Lawley, is what we call deflection, quite common among those with something to hide. Lawley's lips pressed together. Craddock took a step forward. You think you're clever, Lawley, but you made one mistake. You came back for the book because you knew exactly how dangerous it was. That means you're more than just an observer in all of this. That means you're part of it. Lawley's composure cracked just slightly, but it was enough. Miss Marple's voice was soft but firm. The truth, my dear, is rather like a misplaced stitch. No matter how carefully one tries to unravel it, it always has a way of showing itself in the end. Lawley said nothing, but the fight in his eyes was fading. Craddock motioned for his officers to step forward. We'll be having another conversation down at the station. As Lawley was led away, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh of relief. The book was gone, but it had already served its purpose. The truth was out, and the tangled web had begun to unweave. But something still nagged at her, a feeling that not all the threads had been pulled, and Miss Marple had long since learned never to ignore such instincts. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat in her parlour with a cup of tea, her mind troubled. Edward Lawley's arrest should have given her some measure of closure, but instead a gnawing unease lingered. Something was still amiss. The theft of the ledger had been an act of desperation, but had it truly been Lawley alone who feared its contents? Or was he merely another carefully placed piece in a game she had not yet fully grasped? The answer arrived sooner than she expected. A sharp knock on her door startled her from her thoughts. Rising, she opened it to find Inspector Craddock, his face grim. "Miss Marple," he said in a clipped tone, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We have another problem." Miss Marple set her teacup down with a steady hand, though her heart had begun to race. "Oh dear, another problem?" Craddock exhaled sharply. "Lawley is dead." For a moment, neither spoke. The words hung in the air, heavy and unnatural. "How?" Miss Marple finally asked. Craddock's jaw tightened. "Poison. He collapsed in his cell barely an hour ago. We barely had time to question him before he started convulsing." Miss Marple lowered herself into her chair, her expression unreadable. "And what was his last statement?" Craddock hesitated. He asked for a lawyer, then muttered something about the stitch that unraveled. He rubbed a hand over his face. "Damn it all, Miss Marple. Someone is still out there, tying up loose ends. Someone who knows we're close." Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly against her lap, her thoughts whirling. "Poison," she murmured. "A method of killing that requires both planning and proximity. Not an act of impulse, but of necessity." Craddock pulled a chair closer and leaned forward. "This wasn't a panicked mistake. This was calculated. Lawley was silenced before he could give us something useful." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "Which means we must consider what he already revealed, whether he meant to or not." Craddock nodded. "He stole the ledger, yes, but he was also being paid by someone who stood to lose everything if we uncovered the truth." Miss Marple's mind retraced the web of connections, circling back to where it all began. The tailor, the will, the hidden transactions. Someone had orchestrated each event with careful precision, and now they had killed again. She rose suddenly. "Inspector, we must move quickly. Someone is working against us, and I fear they have not yet finished their work." Craddock stood as well, his posture tense. "You think they'll strike again?" Miss Marple's lips pressed together. "No, Inspector. I think they already have." The words had barely left her mouth when another knock sounded at the door, this one frantic. She hurried to open it, revealing a breathless young constable. "Inspector!" the man gasped. "It's Dr. Fellows. He's missing." Craddock swore under his breath, already moving. "Come on, Miss Marple. We need to find him before it's too late." Miss Marple's heart pounded as she grabbed her coat and followed. The night had grown colder, the air thick with the weight of danger. She had no doubt now. The real villain was still ahead of them, and the game was far from over. The village was draped in an eerie silence as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock hurried toward Dr. Fellows' residence, the constable leading the way. The doctor's sudden disappearance confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions. Whoever was behind these crimes was methodical, eliminating threats with careful precision. When they reached the house, the door stood slightly ajar, swaying with the wind. Craddock pushed it open, his hand hovering near his revolver. "Fellows," he called out, stepping inside. The lamps were unlit, casting long shadows across the neatly kept room. On the desk, a half-drunk cup of tea sat beside a medical journal, as if the doctor had been pulled away suddenly. Miss Marple moved to the desk, her eyes sharp. "He was here not long ago," she murmured. "The tea is still warm." Craddock gestured for the constable to check the other rooms while he examined the papers scattered about. "No signs of a struggle," he muttered. "No overturned furniture, nothing missing, except the man himself." Miss Marple's gaze settled on a single piece of fabric caught in the corner of the desk drawer, barely visible in the dim light. She reached out, plucking it free, a tiny scrap of dark blue wool. "Interesting," she murmured, turning it over in her fingers. "This shade, very particular." Craddock looked over her shoulder. "What is it?" She didn't answer immediately, her mind sifting through the tangled web of details, aligning each piece into place. "Inspector," she said at last, "tell me, when Mr. Lawley was found dead in his cell, was he wearing the same clothes in which he was arrested?" Craddock frowned. "No. Now that you mention it, he'd been changed into prison-issue garments." Miss Marple nodded to herself. "And his original clothing, where is it now?" "Bagged as evidence, I suppose." "Then we must retrieve it at once." Craddock didn't question her, signaling to the constable to arrange it. Minutes later, an officer arrived with the bagged garments, placing them on the desk. Miss Marple's nimble fingers worked quickly, spreading out the pieces. A jacket, trousers, a neatly pressed shirt. But it was the waistcoat that drew her attention. She turned it inside out, searching along the seams, and there it was. The same shade of dark blue wool as the scrap she had found. "The lining," she murmured, pressing her fingers against the fabric. It was slightly stiff in places, uneven. Carefully, she took a small pair of scissors from Dr. Fellows's desk and cut through the lining. Craddock watched, tense as something small slipped out. A folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. He snatched it up, unfolding it carefully. The words were faint but legible, an old contract written in precise lettering. The name at the bottom sent a jolt through him. "Arthur Belvedere," he breathed. "The original owner of the tailor shop." Miss Marple's lips pursed. "The tailor who stitched his own shroud." Craddock scanned the paper, his pulse quickening. "This is a debt agreement, but the sum owed is enormous. And look at the second name here. Francis Mortimer." His eyes flicked up. "The late Mr. Mortimer." Miss Marple exhaled slowly, a deep understanding settling over her. Lawley must have found this document, hidden within the waistcoat's lining. He was stealing secrets, Inspector, not just money. This proves Mortimer owed Belvedere a debt so large it could have ruined him. Craddock's expression darkened. And someone didn't want that to come to light. Miss Marple touched the delicate parchment. "We have been searching for a killer among those affected by the present crime. But, Inspector, the motive was never about the present, sir. It was about the past. And if we wish to find Dr. Fellows before it's too late, we must start with the person who stood to lose everything if these debts were exposed." Craddock straightened. "You have someone in mind?" Miss Marple's eyes shone with certainty. "Yes, Inspector, the pattern has finally emerged." Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the faded parchment as she studied the name scrawled upon it. "Arthur Belvedere, Francis Mortimer. A debt large enough to drive a man to ruin. A secret buried in the lining of a waistcoat, stitched away as if its very existence could be concealed forever. But secrets had a way of unraveling, no matter how tightly one stitched the seams." Inspector Craddock paced the length of the doctor's study, the weight of realization settling heavily upon him. "Miss Marple," he said, stopping short, "this was never about a single murder, was it? It was never about Lawley, or even the missing ledger. This was always about something much older, something someone has been desperate to keep hidden." Miss Marple nodded, her sharp blue eyes glinting with understanding. "Indeed, Inspector, and the missing piece to this puzzle has been hiding in plain sight all along." Craddock clenched his jaw. Mortimer's death wasn't about inheritance or a simple business dispute. It was about silencing a truth that could destroy someone's carefully maintained life. A shadow flickered across Miss Marple's face. Yes, and that truth lies in the identity of the one person who benefited the most from all of this. Craddock's brows knitted together. But Mortimer was already a wealthy man. What truth could possibly be worth murder? Miss Marple lifted the parchment. Inspector, have you considered why this document was hidden away in such an unusual place? Why not burned? Why not destroyed? Craddock hesitated. Because Lawley found it first? Miss Marple shook her head. No, because someone else was looking for it long before Lawley ever laid his hands on it. And that someone was the true puppet master behind this entire affair. The constable, who had been silent until now, spoke up. But Dr. Fellows, what if he discovered something? Could that be why he was taken? Craddock swore under his breath. Damn it, we need to find him before... A sound from outside the house made them all freeze. A deliberate creak, the unmistakable press of footsteps against the porch. Craddock reached for his revolver, motioning for silence. Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. Slowly, Craddock edged toward the window and peered out. A figure stood in the lamplight, breath rising in faint clouds against the cold. A man in a dark overcoat, his face partially obscured by the shadows. Craddock threw open the door. "Stop right there!" The man startled, then raised his hands in surrender. As he stepped forward into the light, Miss Marple inhaled sharply. It was Dr. Fellows. His clothes were disheveled, his spectacles slightly askew, but he was unharmed. Craddock lowered his gun, exhaling in relief. "Where the devil have you been?" Dr. Fellows wiped his damp forehead, glancing warily at the gathered group. I was taken." Miss Marple stepped forward. "Taken? By whom?" Fellows swallowed hard. "I couldn't see their face. They blindfolded me and brought me to an abandoned cottage. Told me to stay quiet if I valued my life. I only just managed to get free." Craddock narrowed his eyes. "And what exactly did you discover that made you a target?" The doctor hesitated, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a crumpled envelope. "This," he said. "I found it in Mortimer's personal effects, tucked away in an old medical bag." Craddock took the envelope and flipped it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, yellowed with age. As he scanned the words, his face hardened. Miss Marple leaned in, her breath catching. It was a birth certificate. Father, Francis Mortimer. Mother, unknown. Child, Arthur Belvedere. A hush fell over the room. Miss Marple's voice was barely above a whisper. Arthur Belvedere was Mortimer's illegitimate son. Dr. Fellows nodded. And the debt agreement. It wasn't just a financial arrangement. It was a desperate attempt to keep his existence a secret. Craddock clenched his fists. And someone killed to keep that secret buried. Miss Marple's mind reeled, pieces falling into place. Arthur Belvedere's name vanished after his business collapsed, but someone took up the mantle of protecting his legacy. Someone who knew the truth, someone who had everything to lose. She turned slowly, eyes settling on Craddock. "Inspector," she said quietly, "where was Mrs. Mortimer on the night of her husband's death?" A tense silence filled the room. Craddock's expression darkened. "Are you suggesting—" Miss Marple exhaled. She knew. She must have always known. Dr. Fellows adjusted his glasses. And if the truth about her husband's affair had come out, if society had learned that the respected Mortimer name had an illegitimate heir, it would have destroyed her. She would have lost everything. Craddock's grip on the paper tightened. So she killed him to silence him. She had him poisoned, then turned her attention to Lawley when he got too close. Miss Marple nodded. And when Dr. Fellows stumbled upon the birth certificate, she had no choice but to act again. The doctor shuddered. She said nothing. She never showed her face. But I know now, she's the one who ordered my abduction. Craddock turned sharply to the constable. "Get men to Mortimer's house, now!" The constable rushed out. Miss Marple clasped her hands together, her voice quiet but firm. This was never about mere wealth, Inspector. It was about shame, the shame of a woman whose world depended on a lie. Craddock's expression was grim. And now, we're going to end it. Miss Marple sat quietly in the Mortimer drawing-room, hands folded in her lap, as the fire crackled in the hearth. The grand house had a stillness to it, a hush that did not belong to a home, but to a mausoleum. Across from her, Mrs. Mortimer sat poised, the glow of the fire flickering against her pale face. She had not asked why Miss Marple had called upon her so late in the evening, but the older woman had seen the way her fingers trembled when she reached for her teacup. A woman who knew she was nearing the end of something. Miss Marple smiled gently, the picture of grandmotherly patience. "You must be very tired, my dear," she said, her voice soothing. "These past few days have been quite dreadful." Mrs. Mortimer's fingers clenched around the porcelain. "Yes," she murmured, "dreadful." Outside, Inspector Craddock and his men had taken their positions, waiting for Miss Marple's signal. She had asked them for time to coax the truth out, like one might a frightened bird from its cage. Because Mrs. Mortimer was frightened. Miss Marple could see it in the stiff way she held herself, in the way her eyes darted ever so slightly toward the hallway, as though listening for something. Francis Mortimer was a complicated man, Miss Marple continued, watching her carefully. A man who was not always faithful. But you knew that, didn't you? Mrs. Mortimer inhaled sharply, but did not speak. Miss Marple tilted her head. It must have been difficult, bearing such a humiliation in silence, knowing that he had fathered a child with another woman, a secret that, if exposed, could unravel everything you had built. The teacup trembled in Mrs. Mortimer's grip. "You don't understand," she whispered. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Oh, but I do. You married into one of the most respected families in England. Your name opened doors, secured invitations. But had the truth come out, if society had known that Francis Mortimer had a bastard son, what would have become of you?" Mrs. Mortimer's breathing quickened, her mask beginning to slip. "It wasn't just my reputation," she said, almost to herself. "It was everything, the inheritance, the estate. All of it would have belonged to him." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Arthur Belvedere." Mrs. Mortimer shut her eyes. That name, it should have been forgotten. Miss Marple sighed. But it wasn't. Francis Mortimer could not bring himself to erase his son entirely. He paid to keep him comfortable even after his business collapsed. But debts have a way of catching up, don't they? And when Lawley found that old agreement, when he realized what it meant, he thought he could use it for his own gain. He thought he could blackmail your husband, or perhaps even you. Mrs. Mortimer's eyes opened, dark with something raw. "He was a fool?" Miss Marple regarded her with quiet sympathy. "He was. But then, so was your husband. For keeping that birth certificate at all, for keeping a record of his sins when they should have been burned long ago. But tell me, my dear, was it difficult?" Mrs. Mortimer stiffened. "Was what difficult?" Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but her words sharpened. "Slipping the poison into his brandy, watching him drink it, knowing what was to come. Did he suffer?" A long silence stretched between them. The fire crackled, throwing dancing shadows across the walls, and then, slowly, Mrs. Mortimer exhaled. "No," she whispered. "He never even knew." Outside, Craddock shifted in his hiding place, listening intently. Miss Marple nodded, unsurprised. "You would have ensured it was painless. Not for him, of course, but for yourself. You could not risk him crying out, could you? And then, when you realized Lawley had gotten his hands on the debt agreement, you acted again." Mrs. Mortimer's expression darkened. "I had no choice." Miss Marple sighed. "There is always a choice, my dear." but fear makes people blind to them. Mrs. Mortimer's lips pressed together. And what of your choice, Miss Marple? Why are you here? If you think I will throw myself at your mercy, you are mistaken. Miss Marple did not flinch. I'm here because I wanted to hear the truth from your own lips. I always knew, of course. I knew it the moment I saw the stitching inside the waistcoat. The thread, so delicate, so careful, was not the work of a man. No, it was the work of a woman with hands used to embroidery, used to mending fine fabrics. And I knew then that the person who had hidden that document was not Francis Mortimer. It was you. You found it in his belongings, you stitched it away, and you prayed no one would ever find it. Mrs. Mortimer's expression did not change, but something in her eyes flickered. Miss Marple straightened. But someone did find it. And so, one by one, you removed them. Your husband, Lawley. And when Dr. Fellows stumbled too close to the truth, you had him taken. Mrs. Mortimer's fingers tightened around the armrest. I will not go to prison? Miss Marple sighed, shaking her head. You already know, don't you, that this is the end? Mrs. Mortimer's shoulders sank, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. I had no choice, she whispered. Miss Marple rose to her feet. You did, my dear. But now, the only choice left is how you will face what comes next. A slow, dreadful moment passed, and then, outside, a voice rang through the night. Mrs. Mortimer! The front door burst open. Inspector Craddock stepped inside, his men following swiftly behind. Mrs. Mortimer did not resist as the constable took hold of her arms. She simply closed her eyes, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. As Craddock read her the charges, Miss Marple turned away, her gaze settling on the fire. The flames had burned low now, their glow dimming, their warmth fading. It was over. As the constables led Mrs. Mortimer away, Inspector Craddock let out a long breath, watching her disappear into the night. The heavy door of the Mortimer estate swung shut behind them, leaving only Miss Marple in the dimly lit drawing-room. The fire had burned low, its embers casting faint shadows against the ornate wallpaper. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. Well, that's that. The case is solved. You had it all worked out from the beginning, didn't you? Miss Marple, still standing by the hearth, did not respond immediately. She traced a finger along the mantel, her eyes distant, her thoughts elsewhere. Craddock had seen that look before. It meant she was not finished. Miss Marple? He prompted. She turned, tilting her head slightly. Something is not quite right, Inspector. Craddock frowned. What do you mean? Mrs. Mortimer confessed. She killed her husband to protect her position, then killed Lawley when he discovered the secret. She even had Dr. Fellows taken care of when he got too close. It all fits. Miss Marple smiled kindly. Yes, it does, doesn't it? It fits too well. A little too neatly, I should say. Craddock sighed, rubbing his temples. Miss Marple, surely you're not saying... Tell me, Inspector, where was Mrs. Mortimer when Dr. Fellows was attacked? Craddock hesitated. At home, but she could have arranged it. Could she? Miss Marple interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. Consider the details. We assumed she wanted Dr. Fellows silenced because he might have uncovered the truth. But Dr. Fellows wasn't investigating Mortimer's will or any secret inheritance. He was looking into something quite different. Craddock narrowed his eyes. Go on. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and pulled out a small bundle of fabric. Unfolding it carefully, she revealed a strip of dark blue wool, the same fabric used in Francis Mortimer's waistcoat. The stitching was meticulous, but not in the way one might expect. It was not hidden embroidery or a woman's delicate touch. It was precise, measured, functional. This was not Mrs. Mortimer's work, Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but certain. This was done by someone who understood tailoring, someone who worked with his hands every day. This was the work of a professional. Craddock's brows furrowed. "You mean—" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Inspector. The tailor, Mr. George Weatherby, the man who has been with this family for years, who knew their secrets, who knew their measurements, who knew exactly how much weight Francis Mortimer had lost in the weeks before his death because he had to adjust his suits accordingly." Craddock exhaled. "But why? What motive would Weatherby have?" Miss Marple folded the fabric back into her handbag. "Because he knew the truth long before anyone else did. Weatherby was the one who tailored Mr. Mortimer's clothes. He saw the letters that came from Arthur Belvedere. He understood what they meant. He realized that Mortimer was trying to find a way to acknowledge his son without ruining his wife, and so he acted." Craddock shook his head, but he had nothing to gain from it. Miss Marple gave him a knowing look. "Didn't he? Imagine what might have happened if Arthur Belvedere had come forward, if the will had been rewritten, if the estate had fallen into different hands. And now consider this. Who was the one person no one ever suspected? The tailor, who was always present but never noticed, who heard whispers, who altered garments that carried secrets in their seams." Craddock swore under his breath. "And he let Mrs. Mortimer take the fall." Miss Marple nodded. "Because she was the perfect suspect, because everything lined up just a little too well." Craddock strode to the door, already barking orders to his men. Miss Marple remained by the fire, listening to the hurried footsteps echo through the estate. And then, slowly, she allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The case was not over yet. The streets of St. Mary Mead were still, save for the crisp march of constables' boots as they descended upon Weatherby's modest shop. Inside, the air smelled of chalk dust and wool, the careful order of a tailor's domain untouched by the outside world's chaos. Miss Marple followed Inspector Craddock as he pushed open the door, the small bell above jingling, a polite sound at odds with the tension in the air. George Weatherby stood behind the counter, his sleeves rolled up, spectacles perched low on his nose. His hands, once steady and meticulous, trembled slightly as he set down a pair of shears. His face betrayed no surprise. "So," he said, his voice quiet, "you finally worked it out." Craddock stepped forward. "George Weatherby, I'm placing you under arrest for the murders of Francis Mortimer, Leonard Lawley, and Dr. Fellows." Weatherby gave a small, weary chuckle. "Murders? Is that what you call it?" He looked at Miss Marple. "And I suppose it was you who saw through it all." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "It was always in the details, Mr. Weatherby. A tailor notices things, but so does a simple old woman. The way you altered Mr. Mortimer's suits without question, the way you knew his body was failing long before the doctor did, the way you stitched the truth into the very fabric of his garments." Weatherby sighed, wiping his hands on his apron. "I didn't hate Mortimer, you know. Quite the opposite. He was a man bound by duty, by legacy. He wanted to do right by his son, but he feared the consequences. I simply gave him an escape." Craddock's face darkened. "By poisoning him?" Weatherby's lips pressed into a thin line. "A small dose, over time. He never even realized. By the time he was gone, it looked natural. But then that fool Lawley started asking questions. And the doctor, well, he got too close. You see, people don't notice tailors, Inspector. We move in silence. Listen without being seen." Miss Marple sighed. "And Mrs. Mortimer, you let her take the blame." His expression darkened. "She deserved it." His voice, though quiet, carried a sudden intensity. "She would have destroyed Arthur, just as she destroyed everything else. She cared for nothing but her position, her reputation. And yet, she would have walked free while the boy lost everything." Craddock shook his head. "It's over, Weatherby." For the first time, the tailor's composure cracked. His fingers twitched at his side, eyes darting toward the shears on the counter. Craddock noticed the movement and stepped forward swiftly, grabbing Weatherby's arm before he could reach them. Weatherby sagged, the fight leaving him all at once. "Ah, Well, it was worth a try. The constables led him away, the shop suddenly feeling smaller, emptier. Miss Marple watched as he disappeared into the night, just as Mrs. Mortimer had hours before. The weight of truth hung in the air. Craddock turned to Miss Marple. "It's finished." She gave a small, knowing smile. "Yes, Inspector, for now." As the constables led Weatherby away, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale, settling into its familiar quiet. The soft glow of gas lamps flickered along the street, casting long shadows as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock stepped outside the tailor's shop. The night had an unusual stillness to it, as if holding its breath. Craddock let out a sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "That's that, then," he said. "A strange one, but we got there in the end." Miss Marple clasped her hands before her, her face thoughtful. "Yes, Inspector, and yet—" Craddock frowned. "Yet?" She hesitated, her eyes drifting toward the window of Weatherby's shop, where the measuring tapes and spools of thread sat undisturbed, perfectly arranged. "Something about it still feels incomplete." Craddock frowned. "The man just confessed, Miss Marple." "Oh, indeed. But confessions can be convenient things, can't they?" She glanced at him. "It was all so neatly tied together, don't you think? Almost as if it had been stitched." Craddock gave a tired chuckle. "That's a rather poetic way of putting it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, but the look in her eyes was distant. "Poetic or not, I do wonder if we have seen all there is to see." She took a step forward, looking up toward the constables as they loaded Weatherby into the police car. The tailor sat still, his hands resting calmly on his lap. He looked up as the door closed, his gaze meeting hers through the window, and he smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a quirk of the lips, but it sent a ripple of unease through her. It was not the smile of a broken man, nor of someone resigned to their fate. It was something else, something unreadable. Craddock must have noticed her change in expression because he followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "A man so meticulous, so careful in every stitch, every detail, why would he leave behind such obvious clues?" Craddock exhaled. "You think he wanted to be caught?" She considered this, but then her eyes darkened with something more profound. "Or perhaps, Inspector, he wanted us to think we had caught him." Craddock stiffened. "You don't mean—" Miss Marple turned to him with a knowing glint. "Oh, I do hope I'm wrong, but I fear this is not the last thread in the fabric." Craddock let out a low curse under his breath. "You really think there's more to this?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as if listening to the quiet hum of the night. "Oh, Inspector, a mystery never truly ends, does it? Not when the final stitch has yet to be made." And with that she turned, stepping into the night, leaving behind the lingering question that would surely lead to another tale yet untold.